Okay, so let's move now to the ciliary body. So what is the ciliary body? You always see the ciliary body as like a finger-like projections or finger-like structure. But is it the true anatomical fact of the ciliary body? The answer is no, because you only see a cut section, as the ciliary body in fact acts as a ring of tissue 6 millimeter wide that forms the middle part of the uveal tract extending from the scleral spur to the ora serrata. So what are the functions of the ciliary body? We mentioned two main functions. So the ciliary muscle will control the accommodation. So by contraction of the ciliary muscle, this will lead to increasing the accommodation, and also would help in aqueous drainage. So by contraction of the ciliary muscle would lead to increasing pulling of the trabecular meshwork or opening of the trabecular meshwork pores, leading to aqueous drainage. While the ciliary process acts as the source for aqueous secretion, specifically from the non-pigmented ciliary epithelium. So here is the section that always we see always. This is the cornea and this is the sclera. This is the cut section of the ciliary process, and this is the lens. So this is just a cut section. If you see the eye from anteroposterior, you will find that the ciliary process is a ring of tissue. It's about 6 millimeters wide. And here are the zonule attaching to the equator of the lens. So the ciliary muscle is formed of epithelial part and the muscle part or stroma. So the muscular part, one of the main functions that will cause constriction and dilatation of the pupil through the constrictor pupillae muscle and the dilator pupillae muscle, as we will see now. So the ciliary body extending from the scleral spur to the ora serrata. Here is the ciliary body, as you can see. It will extend here from the scleral spur until here. This is the dentate process of the ora serrata, which is the most anterior part or region of the retina. So all this is called the ciliary body. So what are the regions or what are the parts of the ciliary body? We have two main parts. We have the ciliary process, and we have which is called the pars plicata, and we have the posteriorly is called the pars plana, and we will come to this now. Extension of the sclera or extension of the ciliary body, it's extending from the scleral spur anteriorly toward the ora serrata posteriorly. So all this is the extension of the ciliary body from the scleral spur to the ora serrata. The color of the ciliary body, it is black. And as for the anatomical relations of the ciliary body, it is a triangular in cut section, as we said, extending from the anterior end of the choroid, which is the ora serrata, to the root of the iris, which is the scleral spur. It has an external surface which is related to the sclera, so it is separated from the sclera by the suprascleral space, while the anterior surface or the base, it is to which the iris root is attached. The internal surface is formed by the pars plicata, which give rise to the ciliary process, and the pars plana, which is the posterior smooth part. So here is the cut section of the ciliary body. This triangle, external space, it is related to the sclera and is separated from the sclera by the supraciliary space. Anterior surface or the base to which the iris root is attached, while the internal surface toward the vitreous is separated from the anterior 1/3, which is formed by the ciliary process, and the posterior 2/3 formed by the so this is called the pars plicata, and the posterior 2/3, which is called the pars plana. The ciliary body is formed by uveal portion, which is called the lamina fusca, and the ciliary muscle, and the epithelial portion, which is formed by pars plana and the pars plicata. So the uveal portion, we have the lamina fusca. This will be the same like the lamina fusca of the choroid, as it is a continuation of the lamina fusca of the choroid. So as we said, the suprachoroidal space or the lamina fusca made of collagen fibers and elastic fibers, and has many melanocytes. and contain the anterior ciliary or contain the long ciliary nerves and arteries. So this is one thing that is very important. Another thing that this is the lamina fusca will contain the circulus iridis major and veins. So you remember that I told you that the circulus iridis major does not located in the iris, but it's located into the ciliary body. Another important continuation of the lamina fusca that is anteriorly continuous with the most anterior layer of the iris, which is called the anterior border layer of the iris, while most posteriorly it is located, or it is continuous with the suprachoroidal space. So as we said here, let's review into the this picture. So we said that the suprachoroidal space, here is the Bruch's membrane that we said that is continuous with the basement membrane of the ciliary epithelium, while the most outer layer, which is the lamina fusca of the choroid, the suprachoroidal space here, is continuous with the suprachoroidal space of the ciliary body and continuous with the most anterior layer of the iris, which is called the anterior border layer. About the ciliary muscle consists of three parts. We have the longitudinal fibers, or sometimes it is called the meridional fibers, and the radial fibers or oblique fibers, and finally we have the circular fibers or sphincteric fibers. The ciliary muscle has longitudinal fibers, and the function of this longitudinal fibers is to be attached to the scleral spur. So once it is contracted, it will pull on the scleral spur, leading to opening of the trabecular meshwork, helping the aqueous drainage. While the radial have the radial fibers, which connect both longitudinal fibers and circular fibers together, so it will prevent tearing apart of the muscle as it contracts. And the circular fibers will be when it contracts, it will lead to decrease the ciliary body ring. So it is like a sphincter. So if a sphincter is contracted, this will lead to decreasing the size of the ring, leading to laxity of the zonule, and so the lens has an elastic capsule, so the lens does not have any traction from the zonule, leading to increase the convexity and increase the dioptric power, which is called the accommodation. So let me explain this in more details. Maybe this is just not the right time, but just to understand what we are talking about. So here is this is the lens, and this are the zonule. And these zonules are attached to the ciliary process through the ciliary body ring. So what happens if the ciliary muscle contracts? The ciliary muscle is like any circular muscle. It acts as a sphincter. So if a sphincter is contracted, this will lead to decreasing the size of the ciliary body ring, meaning that this will be the direction of action of the muscle. It will be like toward the inward. So the scleral muscle will be contracting inward, leading to decreasing of the size of the ring. So the ciliary process will be like this. So what happens if the ciliary process become in close proximity to the lens? So the zonule which are stretched, the stretched zonule will no longer be stretched, so they will be relaxed, and the stretched zonule will keep the lens. The stretched zonule will keep the lens flattened. So if the muscle is contracted, this will lead to relaxation of the zonule, and the lens by its structure act as elastic. So when it is elastic, it will lead to a contraction of the lens and acquiring more curvature, so the anterior surface and the posterior surface will be more curved. So this is the basics of accommodation, and I hope that it is clear for you now. Just to so this will be repeated again in the optics and the physiology, so don't bother if you don't understand now. but because it will be repeated later on again and again. So here is the lens, and here is the ciliary muscle. The ciliary muscle has meridional fibers or longitudinal fibers, which is attached to the scleral spur. With its contraction, it will lead to pulling on the scleral spur, opening the trabecular meshwork. We have the circular fibers, which act as a sphincter, or responsible for meiosis, or responsible for accommodation, my accommodation. So by its contraction, this will lead to relaxation of this zonule, leading to the lens acquire more globular shape, while the radial fibers are fibers interconnecting both parts together to prevent the contraction, to prevent the tearing of the muscle. So this is what I was talking about. Here is the unaccommodated lens in which the ciliary muscle is relaxed. So the zonule are in a state of contraction or stretched, causing a more stretch over the lens. Once the lens is contracted, or once the ciliary muscle is contracted, then will lead to decreasing the size of the ciliary ring, leading to what's called slackening of the zonule or relaxation of the zonule, leading to increasing the curvature of the anterior and posterior surface. This is called Helmholtz theory of accommodation. And there is another theory of accommodation. It's called Skaker, and this will be discussed in the physiology. Again, here is the ciliary body with unaccommodated state. The lens, the zonule are stretched, so the lens are stretched. Once the ciliary muscle contracts, this will lead to decrease the size of the zonular ring, leading to relaxation of the ciliary. So the function of this will be to increasing the dioptric power of the lens, or increasing the curvature of the lens to increase the power of the lens to locate the image on the fovea. With old age, we undergo physiological weakening of the lens and the zonular fiber, which is called presbyopia. So this will be an induced or hypermetropic shift of the eye. So we no longer become able to see the near targets. So as the rays arise from the near target will be located outside the retina. So that's why usually people after 40-year-old need to wear reading glasses. The ciliary muscle stroma the ciliary stroma will consist of ciliary muscle, as we said, and the blood vessels, which is the circulus iridis major, and there are some pigments coming from melanin, making the ciliary muscle or ciliary body in black in color. So here again, some sections of the ciliary body showing the meridional fibers or longitudinal fibers, circular fibers, and oblique fibers. Then we come to the epithelial portion. The epithelium portion of the ciliary muscle of the ciliary body is formed from the anterior 1/3 and posterior 2/3. The posterior 2/3, it's called the pars plana or orbiculus ciliaris. You remember that it is the origin of the orbiculoposterior zonular fibers. So it's about 4 millimeters, and its posterior margin will correspond or will be connected to the ora serrata. There are important changes or anatomical changes that occur at the pars plana. So the neurosensory retina continues as the non-pigmented ciliary epithelium, while retinal pigment epithelium will continue as pigmented ciliary epithelium, and the internal limiting membrane will be continuous as the basement membrane of the non-pigmented ciliary epithelium. So this is again one of the changes that occur that you need to know. Let's draw it to have a better understanding. So if we imagine that this is the cornea, and this is the ciliary body, and the ciliary body is continuous with the retina, So what are the changes that occur here? We have a layer, we have 9 layers, we have a layer called the retinal pigment epithelium. This retinal pigment epithelium is continuous with the outer pigmented layer of the ciliary epithelium here, while the neurosensory retina, which is the remaining 9 layers here, is continuous with the inner non-pigmented layer of the epithelium, and the internal limiting membrane is continuous with the basement membrane of the ciliary epithelium, like here. So we will see a picture for this later on. While the anterior one-third is called the pars plicata or the corona ciliaris. So the corona ciliaris is about 2 millimeters, so which basically forming the ciliary process. So ciliary process are formed, it's about 60 to 70. This number is important and it's asked in the exams. Consist of vascular core of connective tissue covered by layered of pigmented epithelium, then the non-pigmented epithelium. So the non-pigmented epithelium will be the one facing the posterior chamber. Dimension of this pars plicata will be 1 millimeter in height and 0.5 millimeter in depth. And since it is covered by, or the most outer layer, or it is the layer, the inner non-pigmented epithelium will be facing the posterior chamber. So if you see, or if you check the ciliary epithelium, you will find it white in color, in contrast to black valleys in between. So here is a section of the ciliary process. So you can see this is the ciliary body, ciliary process, and this is the pars plana, and this is the ora serrata, and this the ciliary process are 70. So if you count this will be 70, and they will give rise to the attachment of the zonular fibers attaching to the equator of the lens, extending more anteriorly than posteriorly. The color of the ciliary process is white in color, in contrast to black valleys in between. So this is important. So the ciliary process is consisting of the vascular core, and this vascular core is important that will cause filtration of the aqueous that will pass through the pigmented and the non-pigmented ciliary epithelium to be filtered to pass through the aqueous, to pass through the posterior chamber. The difference between the inner non-pigmented and the outer pigmented, that the inner non-pigmented epithelium is the anterior continuation of the neurosensory retina, while the outer pigment epithelium is continuation of retinal pigment epithelium. So remember that it is just a pigmented layer. So the pigmented layer of the retina will be continuous with the pigmented layer of the ciliary body. The basement membrane of the inner non-pigmented will be continuous with the inner retinal inner limiting membrane, while the outer pigment epithelium basement membrane will be continuous with the inner cuticular layer of the Bruch's membrane. The inner non-pigmented epithelium will be continuous anteriorly with the posterior pigment of the iris or posterior epithelium of the iris, while the outer pigment epithelium will be continuous anteriorly with the dilator muscle, dilator pupillae muscle. The function of the inner non-pigmented epithelium is to secrete the aqueous. So it will secrete aqueous humor and hyaluronic acid from their apex into the posterior chamber, and the pigmented and non-pigmented epithelium are apex to apex apposition, as we will see now. So if we have now, this is the ciliary body. If we have a magnified image, you will find this is the canal of Schlemm, this is the ciliary body, this is the ciliary process. If we magnify furthermore, you will find that there is here a layer of light color epithelium, which is the inner non-pigmented epithelium facing the anterior chamber, giving the ciliary process the white color, while there is a pigmented layer of the epithelium. Here is the pigmented layer of the epithelium. So this is just this is not the non-pigmented epithelium is the inner one, while the pigmented epithelium is the outer one. So as you can see here, this is again a section showing the vascular core of the ciliary epithelium with the outer pigmented and the inner non-pigmented ciliary epithelium. Both of them are apex to apex opposition. apex to apex apposition. So the aqueous is filtered from the ciliary body stroma, passing to the pigmented cells, then passing to the non-pigmented cells into the aqueous humor. So this slide I prepared to tell you about the transitions within this region. So the suprachoroidal space posteriorly will be continuous with the supraciliary space anteriorly, that is, will continuous into the anterior border layer of the iris. The inner cuticular layer of the Bruch's membrane posteriorly will be continuous with the basement membrane of the pigmented ciliary epithelium. Here. The retinal pigment epithelium will be continuous with the outer with the outer pigmented epithelium of the ciliary muscle or the ciliary body, and will be continuous anteriorly with the dilator pupillary muscle, while the neurosensory retina will be at the region of the pars plana, will be changed to the non-pigmented ciliary epithelium, and the non-pigmented ciliary epithelium will be continuous with the posterior epithelium of the iris. And finally, the most inner layer will be the internal limiting membrane of the retina, will be continuous with the basement membrane of the non-pigmented ciliary epithelium. So this slide will summarize all the transitions within this region, and I hope that it will be clear. Blood supply of the ciliary muscle comes from the circulus iridis major, which we told that it is the anastomosis between the 2 long posterior ciliary arteries and 7 anterior ciliary arteries. So we have 2 long posterior ciliary arteries and anastomosis of 2 long of 7 anterior ciliary arteries. So the anterior ciliary arteries are 2 arteries for each rectus muscle. And since we have a superior rectus, inferior rectus, medial rectus, and lateral rectus, so we should have 8 anterior ciliary arteries. But the fact that we have only 7 because we have one muscle that has only one artery, and this is the lateral rectus, and this is very commonly asked in the exam. So the ciliary arteries are 2 ciliary artery for every rectus muscle except for the lateral rectus. Okay, so for the drainage of the ciliary body, it will be through the vortex veins, again to the superior and the inferior ophthalmic vein into the cavernous sinus, while sometimes we have anterior ciliary vein that may sometimes drain the ciliary muscle only. For the nerve supply of the ciliary muscle, this receives a parasympathetic innervation, and this is one of the most, or let's say it is the most important nerve pathway in the eye, which is the pathway of the light reflex. So what happens when someone is exposed to bright light? So everyone will say there will be constriction of the pupil. So how come this constriction, or how does this constriction occur? So if we have exposed to light that will stimulate the retina, so the pupillary fibers will pass through the optic nerve. The impulse will pass through the optic nerve, then from the optic nerve to the optic chiasma, then to the optic tract. And as visual fibers will pass to the lateral geniculate body, the pupillary fibers will leave this pathway to synapse into the pretectal nucleus. The pretectal nucleus then will give impulses to supply both Edinger-Westphal nucleus on both sides. Edinger-Westphal nucleus is the parasympathetic nucleus of the third nerve, or the oculomotor nerve. So on both sides, the Edinger-Westphal nucleus will give postganglionic fibers that will pass through the oculomotor nerve. Then from the oculomotor nerve, it will the preganglionic fibers will synapse into the ciliary ganglion. Since it is a parasympathetic ganglion, then the postganglionic fibers will pass through the short ciliary nerves to be inserted or to supply the ciliary muscle, leading to accommodation. So it will lead to constriction of the pupil through the sphincter pupillary muscle, and it will supply the ciliary muscle, leading to accommodation. So this is called again the visual pathway, or the pupillary light reflex. So again, when the stimulus is to stimulate the retina, this will lead to passage of impulses through the optic nerve, optic chiasma. This is called the afferent pathway. Optic nerve, optic chiasma, optic tract. Then the pretectal nucleus will supply both Edinger-Westphal nucleus on both sides. Then the efferent pathway will start from the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, passing through the oculomotor nerve to the ciliary ganglion, where it synapse, leading to the postganglionic fibers will pass through the short ciliary nerves to supply the ciliary muscle and the sphincter pupillary muscle. The ciliary muscle also receive a sympathetic innervation to their blood supply or to their blood vessels, and it will be the same like the choroid. So the sympathetic route will pass through the ciliary ganglion without relay to supply through the short ciliary nerves to supply the eye.